Picture this. For roughly 4 decades, the two absolute most powerful nations in human history sat on enough nuclear firepower to literally vaporize civilization. But here's the crazy part. Their actual armies never fought each other directly on a battlefield, not once. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking what I like to call the great paradox of the 20th century, the Cold War. It's a global standoff that completely shaped the world we live in right now. It was a fierce competition fought through secret spies, mind-blowing technology, relentless propaganda, massive military alliances, the actual race to space, and tragically, devastating conflicts fought in entirely different countries.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really wrap our heads around this era, we've got to look at the ticking clock of escalation that totally defined it. I mean, think about it. How exactly does a war stay cold between the main players, yet somehow manage to push the entire human race to the absolute edge of total catastrophe? We're going to trace this timeline, step by step. We'll see how the tension slowly ratcheted up, how the world was literally carved right in two, and how every single move by one side triggered a massive paranoid countermove by the other.
All right, let's set the stage. The year is 1945. The ashes of World War II are barely settling over a completely decimated Europe. And stepping out of that incredible power vacuum, we see two undisputed global superpowers left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. Now remember, they actually fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany. But with their mutual enemy out of the picture, the geopolitical stage was perfectly set for a massive, unavoidable ideological collision.
That wartime alliance, yeah, it shattered almost immediately. Why? Because we're talking about two entirely incompatible systems forced to operate side by side. On one side, you've got the United States championing democracy and free market capitalism. Staying right back at them is the Soviet Union, built on centralized communist rule and a strictly state-planned economy. They looked at each other and honestly just saw an existential threat. Both nations were deeply, deeply terrified that the other was going to force its specific brand of global influence across the entire world.
So driven by this intense mutual paranoia, the entire continent of Europe was effectively carved right down the middle. Nations didn't really have a choice, they were forced to pick a side. They were either securely tethered to the West, or they were absorbed into the Soviet sphere of influence. And this wasn't just some polite political disagreement at a conference. We're talking about the rapid construction of physical, heavily militarized borders straight across a continent that had literally just finished years of horrific bloodshed. Often, these boundaries were drawn simply based on where the respective Allied armies happened to stop marching when the war ended.
By 1946, this division was completely undeniable. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill hit the nail on the head when he famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent. And that phrase, it just perfectly captured the grim reality of the separation. To counter Soviet influence, the United States launched the Marshall Plan. Think of this as a massive, unprecedented economic injection designed to rebuild and stabilize Western Europe. But, as you can guess, the Soviet Union viewed this American financial influence with massive suspicion. Their response? They tightly and heavily strengthened their political and economic grip over the Eastern Bloc.
Then the entire paradigm shifts. The year is 1949. Up until this very moment, the United States had rested pretty comfortably on its total monopoly over the atomic bomb. But then, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own nuclear weapon, and boom, that monopoly vanished literally overnight. Suddenly, the US was vulnerable. This single detonation basically poured a bucket of gasoline on the geopolitical fire and officially ignited the global nuclear arms race. And this brilliantly illustrates how the world reacted to that escalating threat. The globe basically formally locked itself into two heavily armed camps. In 1949, the US, Canada, and several Western European nations formed NATO, which was built entirely on the principle of collective defense. In response to that, by 1955, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies created their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The rules of the game changed. An attack on one was now officially an attack on all. The entire world was formalized into these massive, militarized blocks, yet, amazingly, they still hadn't fired a direct shot at one another.
So, you might be wondering, why didn't these massive military blocks just go ahead and attack each other? Well, it all comes down to one absolutely terrifying strategic doctrine, mutually assured destruction. Also known, rather fittingly, as MAD. Take a second to just really let the grim reality of this sink in. Because both sides possess these immense, unimaginable nuclear arsenals, any first strike absolutely guaranteed a full-scale retaliatory strike. Direct war literally meant civilization-ending suicide. That fragile, apocalyptic balance is actually the exact thing that kept the war cold.
Now, having said all that, it is absolutely crucial to remember that calling it a Cold War is actually a profoundly Eurocentric and frankly, highly misleading term. Sure, for the two main superpowers sitting comfortably in their capitals, it was a standoff. But for millions of people caught in conflicts all around the globe, this era was anything but cold. It was incredibly deadly. The United States and the Soviet Union were still fighting each other. They were just doing it indirectly.
Essentially, the superpowers just exported their violence. Just look at the Korean War, which started in 1950. It was a brutal, grinding conflict between a communist-backed North and a US-backed South. And remember, that ended in an armistice, not a permanent peace treaty. Or look later at the Vietnam War. It became this horrific quagmire, serving as a vicious indirect battleground where the US got deeply involved supporting the South against communist allies in the North. These competing, abstract ideologies violently played out on the ground, at the tragic cost of millions of local lives.
But listen, the danger wasn't just confined to these proxy wars overseas. Remember that ticking clock we talked about? Well, it was still speeding up, leading humanity straight to the absolute brink.
In 1962, that clock struck midnight. The Cuban Missile Crisis. American intelligence suddenly discovers Soviet nuclear missiles secretly positioned in Cuba. That's just 90 miles off the US coast. Let that sink in. For 13 agonizing, terrifying days, President John F. Kennedy and the entire world watched nervously. Humanity was quite literally bracing for total nuclear war. Ultimately, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the weapons. But to this day, it remains the absolute closest our species has ever come to intentional self-annihilation.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the battleground wasn't just on maps or in jungles anymore. The competition was moving relentlessly upward, right into the cosmos. The Cold War transformed into an intense, incredibly publicized race for total technological superiority. The space race unfolded at just a breakneck pace. In 1957, the Soviets completely stunned the West. They launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. Then, 4 years later, they scored again by putting Yuri Gagarin into orbit, the first human in space. The United States panicked, pouring absolutely astronomical resources into the Apollo program. But it paid off. By 1969, they achieved the impossible. American Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And you have to understand, this wasn't just scientific exploration. Oh no, it was a supreme projection of technological, economic, and ideological dominance, broadcast live to the entire world. Okay, fast forward to the 1980s, and the dynamic fundamentally shifts. Despite boasting a massive, intimidating military, the Soviet Union was basically hollowing out from the inside. The sheer rigidity of a centrally planned economy simply could not keep pace with the massive economic engine of the West. Their system began to visibly crumble under its own weight. So, the crucial point is how breathtakingly fast things unraveled once reforms actually began. Step 1. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduces glasnost and perestroika. These were reforms meant to make the Soviet system a bit more open and economically viable. But, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. The idea of political change spread like wildfire. Step 2. In 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, totally shattering the ultimate physical symbol of the communist-democratic divide. Then, Step 3. By 1991, the Soviet Union itself officially dissolves. And just like that, through this crazy rapid domino effect, the Cold War was effectively over. But wait, while the conflict officially ended and the United States emerged as the world's dominant superpower, the legacy of the Cold War, it is absolutely everywhere today. It completely forged modern international politics and the alliances we still see on the news. It birthed today's intelligence agencies and radically accelerated technologies we literally use every single day. And, perhaps most terrifyingly, those massive arsenals of nuclear weapons they developed back then, yeah, they didn't just disappear. Their existence continues to heavily dictate global relations right now.
This era really teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous conflicts aren't actually the ones where armies are fighting directly on a battlefield. Sometimes they're the ones where fear, ideology, technology, and the raw pursuit of power keep the entire world holding its breath. Which leaves us with a final, absolutely crucial thought to reflect on. The Cold War may have officially ended in 1991, but looking at the world today, are we still living in its shadow? Keep that in mind as you look at today's international relations. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.